This is the Pear Review, a podcast about philosophy, literature and art. Today I'm going to talk about the social function of the ancient Greek comedy, and I will look closer at how comedy can function as a means of a state apparatus. Now, comedy is a genre that is very dear to me, but today I will look beyond the jokes and fun of it. While comedy perhaps is made to make us laugh, I'm personally more interested in approaching comedy from a serious point of view, given my informal background in critical theory, which was one of my biggest hobbies before studying philosophy in an academic context. So first, I would like to tell you about how I began to look under the hood of comedy. During my master's in literature, I followed a course called The Ancient Theatre in Context, where we approach ancient Greek theatre from non-literary perspectives, namely archaeology, geography, architecture, mythology, sociology, psychology, etc. The point was to understand ancient theatre not mainly as an artistic output of geniuses, but as a social institution. So today, I will go over some traits of ancient theatre and suggest some of their social functions. I will also apply the same theory on contemporary comedies, as I believe some of the basic mechanisms in both comedy as well as society has been preserved for a couple of thousand years. First, I will introduce Marcus Asper's theory of the old comedy's political function, and then I will try to transfer his analysis of old comedy onto the new comedy. And just so we know, the old comedy was from about 480 to 323 BC, and the new comedy is from around 323 to 260 BC. In the article Group Laughter and Comic Affirmation, Aristophanes' Birds and the Political Function of Old Comedy, Asper illustrates what kind of audience one might have expected to see in the theatre in the 5th century BC. The Dionysius theatre held an audience of 15,000 people, which meant that around half of the people eligible to vote were able to see each play. Because of a costly entrance fee, Asper believes that this created a separation where the audience consisted mainly of the 15,000 richest Athenians. Also, I would like to add a piece of information that many of you won't necessarily be aware of. The plays were submitted to be performed during a religious festival, namely the Dionysius Festival, as part of a competition where the best tragedy, comedy and satyr play would win a prize. While this wasn't necessarily as solemn as a conservative Christian church service, we can expect plays to stress certain values in the context of a religious festival. Given this, Asper believes that in order to win, the dramatist had to please the majority of these rich men attending a religious festival. Therefore, the dramatist would ideally have to please 15,000 of the richest Athenians more or less through flattery and pandering to the dominant values of the day. With this in mind, Asper argues that the old comedy was not critical and satirical as many people have imagined, but that it had an affirmative stance to the ruling order of society, instead of undermining and making fun of the status quo. So contrary to many superficial readings of, for example, Lysistrata, Asper attempts to question the view of Aristophanes' comedies as promoting pacifism and criticizing religious cults. This was perhaps done rather indirectly. Rather than portraying the characters as identical to the upper-class audience that attended the theatres, the protagonist often stood in conflict with the audience's views. The protagonists were also likely to belong to a lower class. But as an exception, in The Birds, we see a character that the audience can identify with, which make The Birds a so-called fantasy of power. And it is the comedy that led Athenian citizens to understand this as an amusing and openly flattering fantasy concerning their own ambition. So the view of The Birds as being an escapist or anarchic play therefore has to be reconsidered. Asper means that, generally speaking, one wouldn't stage a play in Athens that differed too much from the dominating values within the institutional context of the theatre. By looking at several comedies in addition to the birds, Asper illustrates how these comedies have a plot whereby an Athenian with an overly utopist idea is allowed to act out his ideas. One might say that the revolutions and utopias one might see in the old Attic comedies often would seem absurd in their time, and that it was simply understood as superficial comedy rather than as political satire towards a system that actually was in power. So the short version, Aristophanes seemed to be portraying people that wanted radical change to society as clowns. In addition to claiming that old comedy is affirmative of established systems and values, Asper also argues that the old comedy makes fun of eccentric individuals, even though a standard interpretation of this motive is to show its didactic and exemplary function. Asper argues that the ridicule of eccentricism in the comedy works more as a signifying line between good Athenians and bad non-conforming Athenians. The jokes are made from a perspective of high society and is directed at what deviates from this identity. So even though the Athenian citizens laugh together, they laugh at something or someone and down at whatever was displayed to be ridiculed on the stage. We should also keep in mind that the jokes in the ancient comedy was not spontaneous as such, but were an accepted part of a larger ritual. So Mary Douglas, the British anthropologist, claimed that the nature of a joke depended on its social context. There's a difference between spontaneous jokes and the kind of jokes one might see in a ritual context. The joke attains an affirmative character as it is part of a rite, and the message of a standard rite is that the ordained patterns of social life are inescapable. Furthermore, Douglas emphasizes that jokes are collective and network affirmative, even though the function and content of the joke is variable. For Asper, the audience of the old comedy was this kind of group whose unity was strengthened by laughter directed at the seemingly absurd and impossible. So to conclude, we can say the following about Asper's view of the old comedy. The comedy was affirmative, consisting of jokes with a normative view of Athenian citizens. The comedy induced laughter and ridicule around rebellion against the citizens' identity or the structure of society, and it is possible that only the upper class of society laughed at this, but not society as a whole. Now that we have a basic theoretical background, I want to apply some of the same observations to the context and themes of the new Attic comedy. From Aristophanes' The Birds, Asper's main example of the old comedy, to Menander's The Misanthrope, there were several important political and cultural changes that, I will claim, affected the comedy as a genre. The form and content of the comedy is affected by the transformation from Attic to Hellenic culture, the transformation from a democratic rule to a more aristocratic rule also converges with the transformation from political themes to love intrigues as a subject for comedy. Just as Asper sees affirmative traits to the old comedy, traits of an affirmative character are also possible to find in the new comedy. This point of view is also held by Brockett and Hildy. But in recent years, some critics have come to view these plays as works that have questioned and then reaffirmed certain societal conventions during a period when the values and mores were being challenged. Thus, they treat the plays as reflections of a prevailing ideology rather than merely frivolous, diversionary entertainment. It is also important to note that the societal conventions of the old comedies have faded away. There is, to a higher degree, higher class characters that are dominant, and the plot often centers on intrigues concerning the people's status and future. For example, there is a potential threat to a rich family's honor that we see in The Misanthrope. To fall in love with a girl of uncertain identity and social status is a threat to society where political power no longer is democratic, but more hierarchical. Therefore, young men's love affairs may pose a larger threat to patriarchal families than what we would see in contemporary Western society. Additionally, women gaining power as in Lysistrata or assemblywomen, or grouches that won't help the affluent society in The Misanthrope, are not just threatening and exciting as plots, but could represent agitating eccentricism in their time. Through comedy, the subversive and impossible could go on for as long as the play lasted, but to an audience in Athens, certain elements of the plays must have seemed like science fiction. The women's suffragette didn't come to Greece before 1952. Instead of the feminist coup in Lysistrata or Assemblywoman, the Misanthrope concerns a less politically tense subject, the question of whether or not two citizens should or shouldn't get married. A problematic aspect we can see in the Misanthrope is how a society based and structured around agriculture is dependent on cooperation. Gary Reed writes the following on agriculture and the Misanthrope. For the most part, protective labor was exercised by individuals and their families on their own farms, as the grouch in Menander's play, who eschewed the help of his neighbors. But even in the sphere of self-efficient agriculture, the rhythms of labor demand were such that the farmers must have depended at harvest time on the assistance of others, with the mutual help of neighbors or the services of paid seasonal laborers. We can see how Cnaemon's rule is provocative in a Hellenistic society that tries to be a society where many individuals cooperate in one way or another. As we shall later see, Cnaemon is not only at the edge, but radically outside of the society. His anti-materialistic views does not only punish himself, but is also a potential threat towards his neighbors, as he can't even help them by lending tools, because he doesn't have any, and is, because of his isolationism, in danger of not getting help from his neighbors when he falls into the well. The eccentric and outsider Cnaemon represents not only a farmer on the periphery of Athenian society, but demonstrates an obstinacy that could possibly materialize itself as a concrete threat to the structure of Hellenistic society. Cnaemon's isolation from the society around him can be understood as anarchy and in opposition towards society's basic morals. It is also important to note that the opposition in class that becomes apparent between the countryside and the city. In the Misanthrope, a large part of the dialogue is dominated by antagonism between the people from the polis and the people from the countryside. The polis consists of flâners and dandies, while the countryside consists of hard workers and voluntary or involuntary ascetics. The suspicion against affluence is clear from the beginning of the play, when Gorgias sees Sostratos wearing a smart cloak. So here lies much of the play's conflict. A young man from the countryside accuses a naive dandy from the polis for wanting to rape his sister. Before Sostratos has done anything wrong, Gorgias is on guard and against him and accuses him of having dishonorable intentions. In this play, we shall see that a lot of prejudices and complications are laid open from the beginning. As we eventually see, the prejudices against people from the polis is false, and even higher class people can have good intentions. For, as far as we learn, Sostratus wants an honorable marriage even without a dowry. The Misanthrope was first performed around 360 BC and represents a change in Greek comedy. The Misanthrope is the only complete comedy of Menander, except for around 9 lines missing. It is also the only complete play of new comedy altogether. So instead of spending a lot of time simply summarizing the play, I suggest that you check out the Misanthrope's Wikipedia page. So let's look at some of the features of the new Eddic comedy to see what changed between the old and new comedy. A new feature with the comedy structure, at least according to the Misanthrope, is that it's divided into 5 acts. The choir has lost its active part in the plot and is only used as a kind of intermission, entertainment or light musical pieces throughout the play, marked in the text with choir or intermission with a choir. There is therefore not an active interaction between choir and individual characters as in the old comedy, which was a regular feature in both the old tragedy and comedy. A study of Menandric fragments before the publication of the complete Misanthrope also indicates that the use of only 3 actors was abandoned in the new comedy, as Calories argued in 1910, before the Misanthrope was discovered in its entirety. In his article, he said, "There is absolutely no trace of hint in the economy of these fragments of a restriction in the number of available performance. but it should be noted that we have no positive information on the subject. This at least implies a development in the use of more actors than before, unless the speedily changing of masks between three actors was already used as a comic effect in Menander's time. This is now known as a technique in modern theatre and comedy, where travesty and farcical situations around transvestism or other role changes is used as a comic technique. It should also be mentioned that the old comedy's light and spontaneous rhythm is displayed with a tighter, more Aristotelian plot, instead of an almost incoherent display where the action is excessive and surrealistic, and where the jokes come thick and fast. The joke in the comedy of Menander is often relegated in favor of the comic plot, as in situation comedy, which isn't necessarily comical in itself anymore. The comic in comedy is often set aside from an easily accessible level of outright jokes to small interludes in the action which are not strictly or by necessity related to the overall conflict of the characters in the situation. In the Misanthrope, we generally see fun when the cook or the slave is present, often conversing with Cnamon or with each other. They are more or less like a pair of circus clowns that act as comic relief. We also get the sense when comparing the old and new comedy that the so-called old comedy was too marked by its time and simply too vulgar for Hellenistic audiences. By this I mean that some of the phallic symbolism and the use of costumes in the old comedy was now gone. The jokes in the Misanthrope are not sexually explicit, and there are not a use of fart jokes and latrine humour as in the old comedy. The sophisticated Menander, with his sophisticated language and culture, was fit for the youth of this new era, which harmonizes with the thesis that the Greek comedy is affirmative, even though it doesn't appear in the exact same ritual frame as before. The comedy in its new form is neither especially excessive, jokey, or explicit. The world in the new comedy is not turned on its head, but told more or less as it is. But we see to a larger degree the use of generalized types of people as both successful and misfit stock characters. In the Misanthrope, several of the types are recognizable from Theophrastus' works on moral characters. Menander doesn't use many of these extensively, but has developed his own stock characters and has named plays after them. Now, there is uncertainty on whether or not Menander was directly influenced by Theophrastus. Aside from the Misanthrope, in the Misanthrope, we see plays based on characters such as the farmer, the hero, the flatterer, and the drunkard. The most easily recognizable caricatures in the Misanthrope are Chaereas as a parasite of the flatterer. In the Misanthrope, Chaereas is a parasitical sidekick, but does not fit easily into the flatterer role. In addition to Cnamon as the Misanthrope, we also have Psychon as the cook and Simica as the old hag. Two of the characters, Sositos and Gorgias, is on the other hand presented as virtuous and complex characters. But we can note that even though the play made fun of specific types and professions, the upper class seems spared of ridicule. The ridicule of the new comedy is directed downwards rather than upwards. The view of comedy as a ventilating act where the order of society is inverted and the low class ridicules the higher class is therefore not fitting to the new comedy. The themes of comedy changes from grand politics concerning the people that went to the democratic assembly to the individual, familiar, and romantic, which concerned the Hellenistic audience, where society became less democratic. It is obvious that the function of the new comedy was meant to be didactical and adapted to youth rather than transgressive latrine humor the audience could laugh at. The view of the comedy as a ventilating act where the order of society is inverted and the low class ridicules the higher class is therefore not fitting of the new comedy. The themes of the comedy changes from grand politics concerning the people that went to the democratic assembly to the individual, familiar, and romantic, which concerned the Hellenistic audience where society became less democratic. It is obvious that the function of the new comedy was meant to be didactical and adapted to youth, rather than transgressive latrine humor the audience could laugh at. While the obscenities are ventilating in a society with otherwise strict norms, the new comedy instead becomes overbearing and moralising. While the old comedy shows us a society that is brought out of order without being restored, We see people that make mistakes and learn necessary lessons in the new comedy. We also see that the plot adapts to the macroscopic development of society. The power of the old comedy, the democratic assembly, is replaced by family ties and patriarchal values in the Misanthrope. The pride that came of being Athenian or from a polis is also directed against suspicious characters on the periphery of Athenian society in the countryside. The misanthrope or the hermit are represented as suspicious anti-Athenians that are not only people skeptical towards urbane or rich people like Gorgias, but people who establish their own anarchic territories in the countryside where Athenian law and moral is abandoned. The play seems to repeat some of the moralising we see in the satyr play, The Cyclops, where the Cyclops wants to live outside of society with its own laws. In Cnaemon's case, he gets punished and learns his lesson by falling into the well and has to wait for a while for help to arrive. If he had a good neighbor or a slave to help him, things could have gone better. In the beginning of the play, we see him work and struggle, which makes both his body and mind deteriorate. Since a misanthrope is a stock character, he doesn't appear as a realistic, subversive political power, but is someone one can laugh at and ridicule. He is a nouveau poor that can't handle the poverty and lowliness he has inflicted on himself. His rigidity makes him impotent as a person of power, and he is unable to move both horizontally and laterally, which is to the highest degree symbolized with his fall into the well and the crippledness by his injuries. Falls like that entail a lesson for the affected characters, and in the misanthrope we witness at least two learning curves. One learning curve lies with Gorgias, and on the other with Cnaemon. In Gorgias' case, he, as a young man from the countryside and a protective brother, is disposed with suspicions towards potential courters that wants his sister, especially people from the polis that are expected to take advantage of people from the countryside. His aggression towards Sostratos is blinded by the power that is represented by his fine cape. The learning curve and the learned lesson occurs when he gets convinced that Sostratos wants to marry his sister without dowry, and when Gorgias hears Sostratos' speech about money. Another learning curve can be seen with Cnaemon, who doesn't want help from his neighbors and won't offer help to them. This comical rigidity and hermitage is in a large degree outside of the Aristotelian middle way and therefore leads to his downfall, represented by his fall into the well. When he is saved by Gorgias and talks about how far he has wandered astray from the middle path, we witness another lesson learned, and we can conclude that both Gorgias and Cnaemon has learned something important. We can therefore presume that the new comedy is meant to be moralistic and improving upon citizens, an art form with a more or less obvious didactical intention than the more obviously ventilating old comedy. There are good grounds to claim that the new comedy's moralism is both meant to be mimed after and mimetic in the Aristotelian sense as being more realistic than the old comedy. As stated in the Poetics, epic and tragic poetry, as well as comedy and dithyramb poetry, and most of aulos and guitarra art, generally speaking, are all imitations. In addition, Aristotle claims that the comedy often imitate people that are baser than present people, which fits the old comedy better than the new comedy, as characters in the new comedy are baser to a lesser extent. The old comedy's rigid character is changeable to the extent that characters get punished, even though they don't go through a transformation or development. The new comedy displays a nobler gallery of characters, a nobler language and actions, and can therefore be said to be better, didactically speaking, for the audience. Also, the comic universe, which in the old comedy is an inversion of a society where slave becomes master and master becomes slave, is substituted with a normal, if not normative, world in a new comedy, where master is master and slave is slave. In the misanthrope, we also lack an overall funny story, and the fun appears only in brackets within a serious and family-oriented plot. And now I want to look a little bit at the gender roles in new comedy. The moralistic motif in the new comedy is stressed in Elaine Phantom's article Sex, Status and Survival in Hellenistic Athens, a study of women in new comedy. She argues that there is a prejudice against the comedy as misogynous, and that most of the plays of Menander, which have survived, are in the naturalistic tradition, ethical comedies which try to be realistic and to apply everyday moral rules. Their problem is to reconcile romance with morality, and the plot assumes the existence of love or infatuation between the male protagonist and a girl and set out to reconcile its demands with those of respectable society. The new comedy thus seems like a moralistic interlude between the obscene old comedy and the escapist comedies of Plautus, where both master and slave are in a vacation mode. One might also call new comedy a pre-romantic comedy, since it is a comedy with love as a theme, but little or no direct romantic interaction between the lovers. Fantham explains how a romantic plot isn't easily structured around arranged marriages, and that eros before and not after marriage makes a romantic plot. In addition, Cnamon's asceticism leads to him not having anyone to look after his daughter when she goes to fetch water, and he hasn't got slaves that can fetch water. This is the opening that makes the meeting between Sostratus and the girl possible. Fantham remarks that the mark of Atapenery was a single old woman attendant, which fits with Simoke, who herself would have fetched water, but is helped by Cnamon's daughter after having lost the bucket into the well. A similar observation is made by Susan Gettle Gold, who writes that husbands and fathers kept their wives and daughters under their protection at home in part because they did not trust them, but also because they did not trust other men. Greek standards of modesty demanded that women be protected from any sort of physical contact with any man not her husband. One might therefore say that Cnamon's asceticism is a character fault that endangers not only himself, but also potentially his daughter, that might meet men outside of his control. Callippidus' agreement to allow Sostratus to marry Cnamon's daughter and Gorgias to marry Sostratus' sister is for Fantham an exceptional feature, by which Fantham means that, in other plays, rape and pregnancy was often necessary for a father to allow his son a marriage with an unknown girl. As an explanation on the gradual development from the old comedy to the new comedy, where family life gets a dominating role, Fantham also presents another argument on the change from politics to family, other than the case that the audience were not longer as involved in politics. But tragedy was dead, and Menander's generation, with their intense interest in everyday human behavior, might well feel that a domestic crisis merited a serious treatment and enabled them to achieve something approaching tragic pathos. This also tells us that comedy is still a forum to discuss actual subjects, where the normative morals are represented repeatedly in the public forum, namely on the theatre stage. Even though the subject of rape is a latent threat from Gorgias' point of view, it is nevertheless brought up as a subject in the play, and often appears as a subject in other comedies. We can thereby get a sense of what people meant, for example, about rape at the time the plays were written. The documentary value of these plays, it seems to me, lies in two features: the illustration of external pressure on marital partners, and the implication that thinking men now looked beyond sexual fact to sexual responsibility. In Plutarch, we can read that the new comedy, represented by Menander, is neither for the too sober nor for the too inebriated. The plot is also noble enough for men to meet their wives in a noble manner later in the evening. This serves as a contrast to the old comedy, which was more erotic and better suited for the drunk. We don't know if Plutarch read the same play as us, but his commentaries seem to resonate with the view we get by comparing the old and new comedy. Even though women weren't likely to have been present at Menander performances, men were present, and they would have learned through its didactic presentation of the necessary and good conditions around romance and marriage. Susan Leip, in Reproducing Athens, also claims that the Misanthrope deploys eros specifically to generate a citizen marriage. If the Misanthrope is about the reproduction of citizens, one can also see that, together with Plutarch's view of Menander, the Misanthrope seems an excellent didactic piece concerning the marriage and the continuation of families. The audience can, more or less, take from the play the necessary values needed in a family or a marriage. And now, To conclude, we saw that the Athenian society went through both political and cultural changes from the time of the Old Comedy to the time of the New Comedy. Keeping Asper's linking of the theatre and its context in mind, one might also adapt his findings about the Old Comedy to a reading of the New Comedy. We might also transfer the same analysis to contemporary comedies. We can see that outsiders are represented negatively and that the parallels between the romantic plot and the plot concerning Cnaemon's fall and transformation as a moralizing story for the audience.